In our last two lectures, we have traced the conceptions of God from the Paleolithic to the invasions of India and Europe and Anatolia and the Middle East. This time we'll go one step beyond that to the idea of a male creator God, which in one way culminates in the great three monotheistic religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. In the process, we'll revisit some of our earlier myths and we'll also take up some new ones to demonstrate how this works. The first half of this lecture will talk about trying simply to show what a male creator God looks like, but we'll also discover in the process that a male creator God is frequently distant and remote and transcendent, detached from nature, so that kind of remoteness and detachment has been problematic for many people. So that in the last part of this lecture, we'll take a look at some of the ways in which people have tried to bridge this gap, to reduce the space between a God out there and us who live here. In the last lecture, we saw that one of the consequences of the migrations of the Iron Age was the usurpation of some of the goddesses' powers and roles by male sky gods. One important one was the claim, as growing as we watched it happen in our last lecture, the claim to be the ultimate creator, the source and essence of all being. This didn't, of course, happen all at once, but it happened in stages. Zeus, as we've seen, is the king of the gods, but he still has to deal with a large pantheon, all of whom are parts of his extended family. Hades is the lord of the underworld, and Poseidon is the lord of the sea. Athena is the goddess of wisdom, Ares the god of war, and so in a way, he does share some of his authority with all of these other gods and goddesses. And as we discovered back in Lecture 12, the pantheon of the Greeks was probably a reflection of the structure and functioning of an aristocratic family in Greece at the time. The absence of any real solid central authority on Mount Olympus might very well have been a reflection of the political circumstances in Greece of the time, with many independent city-states not held into anything resembling an empire in the way that it was happening in other parts of the world, like the Middle East, Anatolia, and occasionally even in Egypt. It wouldn't happen in Greece. This kind of unification wouldn't happen in Greece until centuries later, when Athens and Sparta would establish hegemony over groups of city-states, and that, of course, triggered the Peloponnesian War. In other parts of the world at the same time, however, there was a marked movement towards centralization. And in a way, this was necessary in a violent age when warfare went on almost all the time. A central authority is an extremely efficient way to govern, all the way from the military all the way down to collecting taxes and distributing grain and beer. Down through history, a lot of countries have reverted to this model in times of crisis. All of these new city tasks seem to have been originally managed by males. They became the soldiers, the scribes, the mathematicians, the priests, the foremen, the governors, and the kings. The consolidation, that kind of consolidation found its reflection in other aspects of life. As God was to the cosmos, so the king was to his country, so the father was to his family. We're very familiar with that idea. In the West, it lasted all the way up until the French Revolution. And all of this effort toward consolidation is reflected in myth, too, which, as we've noticed, tends to explain and justify and sanction political and social and economic structures on Earth. What emerged mythically from all of this was the idea of a supreme male deity who had always existed and was the source of all being. He had no father, he had no mother, he had no brothers and sisters, and usually he had no children either, although there are occasional exceptions to this rule. The Christian God has a son, but the doctrine of the Trinity makes it difficult to see them as separate beings or of different generations. Most often, this newly powerful creator God creates by divine word or wish or will, using language or mind or reason to do what in female terms had always been a birthing process. As Leeming and Page say it, as the creator, he was the logical result of the usurpation by earlier divine masks of essential life-giving powers. His immediate archetypal ancestors were the sky god fecundators of a depersonalized earth who denied the old female source of fertility and attributed that power to themselves, the sun gods, whose passage through the skies proclaimed light, order, and reason, and whose very being, like that of the sun, was the essence of existence. What we'd expect is that this would lead sort of inevitably to monotheism, and it did with the Hebrews. But even in polytheistic religions, there was a movement toward the idea of a king of the gods, while the others became functionaries or bureaucrats, each administering some part of the king's authority. Marduk became such a king in Babylon, Zeus in Greece, Odin in Norse mythology, Indra in India, Baal in Canaan, Ptah in Egypt by about 3000 BCE. It was a demonstration of God's power that he could create with words. Most famously in the passage that we all know, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Just saying the words makes it happen. We remember from Unit 1 that this creation story belongs to the ex nihilo category of cosmogonies. In Lecture 7, we did a Mayan account, and we said there that the implications of this kind of creation story include the fact that God is very powerful, who is able to imagine, to dream, to speak the cosmos into existence without any real opposition at all. There are other kinds of stories like this. There's a Maori account from New Zealand in which the god Io exists from eternity, but in an undifferentiated state within immensity. The universe is dark, there is water everywhere. He speaks to stop being inactive, and when he names things, light and dark, earth and sky, water and land, they separate by the sheer power of his words. The Aranda people in Central Australia have a really rather complex and charming story about a creation of this sort too. Their god is Karora, who had existed from the beginning, lying in a kind of eternal sleep underneath the ground. While he's sleeping, he dreams, he thinks, he has visions, and what happens is the first time that he dreams and thinks things, a group of bandicoots emerge from his navel and armpits. The bandicoots then rise through the sod, and the sun rises for the first time, and Karora wakes himself up, and he catches a couple of bandicoots and eats them. When the sun sets, he goes back to sleep again, and in his sleep, he produces, again from his armpit, a bull roarer. Now, a bull roarer is a piece of wood with holes cut in each end. In one end, you put a string, and then you whirl it, and if you whirl it, it makes a kind of whistling or humming sound. It's used in a lot of Aranda ceremonies. During the night, that bull roarer, which he had given birth to, sort of metamorphoses into a young man, so that in the morning, Karora finds this groggy young man resting on his arm that wasn't there the night before. He performs a ceremony to bring him completely to life. This may be something of the same ceremony that was used in initiation ceremonies by these people. But then he sends out his son to capture more bandicoots. He figures he's got a son now, let his son catch the bandicoots. Next night, 2 more sons emerge from Karora's armpits, and this goes on for many, many nights until all the bandicoots have been eaten by this growing family. There's a lot more to this story, but our point is that we have here another male creation story. This one's not quite classic. Karora doesn't really plan creation, it just happens while he's asleep. This creation is also a little bit flawed, as was the Mayan account, where it took 4 tries to get human beings right. This one is flawed by not making enough bandicoots to start off with to feed this growing family. Why the armpit? Well, this isn't the first time we've run across a male who creates from his armpit. We remember Ymir did that back in Lecture 8. Barbara Sproul says that, in a way, the armpit is the logical place. If a male is going to give birth in this kind of way, that it has to be the armpit, because it has a cup shape, it secretes sweat, so that it's structurally similar both to the mouth and to the vagina, or the womb anyway. Our point is that there's a clear indication here, even if this is a logical transference, it's an indication of how much of the process of birth and creation is being taken over from the goddesses and given to male gods instead. The Zuni of Southwest America have an emergence myth similar to the one that the Navajo that we looked at in Lecture 6. But the creation of the universe into which the humans emerge is done by one Awana Walona, who's the father of fathers, who existed in and of himself from the very beginning. He conceives within himself, and he divides himself into being or light and into non-being or darkness or order and chaos. Through thinking, he gives birth to primordial waters, then to the sun. As the sun, he then mates with the waters to produce heaven and earth and all creatures on it. This part of the story, that part of the story looks back to the birth and parturition myths of the goddess. But he's responsible by himself for the first part of creation, and he provides the principles of order and light, which he applies to the principles of chaos and darkness, here again imagined as female waters. The goddess has by this time pretty clearly lost the battle. We can't really leave this part of our account without taking a quick look at, for us anyway, the most famous such ex nihilo story from Genesis and its creator, Yahweh. The Hebrew story that we're looking at is the only one that comes from a really solidly monotheistic tradition, which seems like the natural and logical conclusion of the developments we've been tracing. But the Hebrews, as far as we know, didn't start out as monotheists either. S. David Sperling, in his entry on God in the Encyclopedia of Religion, says there are really two theories about how the Hebrews arrived at monotheism. The first one is that during most of their history, they were polytheists, with Yahweh as their national god, as the national Moabite god was Shemash, or the Assyrian one was Ashur, or the Babylonian one was Marduk. But beginning about the 8th century BCE, the Hebrew prophets began to say that even acknowledging other gods would bring down the wrath of Yahweh on the Israelites by aligning foreign powers against them. When Judah fell in 587 BCE, all those prophecies seemed to be coming to pass. The Babylonian captivity convinced many Jews that their dispersion proved that God was a universal God who could use other peoples to punish the Israelites for sins. The most stunning and clear explication of that idea is the second half of Isaiah. It's a very passionate presentation of that idea too, that God is so universal that he can use other peoples to punish his chosen people, the Israelites. According to this theory, it was after the Babylonian captivity that much of what comes down to us as the Old Testament was put together. And according to this theory, it writes back into Jewish history the idea of monotheism, sort of retrospectively endorsing what the prophets had said before all of these calamities that befell Judah and Israel. The other theory is that Hebrew monotheism was Mosaic in origin, dating from the Exodus from Egypt, and that's where monotheism really comes to the Hebrews. And that in that reading, all of the references to worship of other gods in the Old Testament are always associated in the Old Testament with lapses, with sin, with falling away from truth. A third kind of mediating position is that Israel was always monolatrous. That is, it was committed to the worship of one God, which doesn't necessarily deny the existence of other gods. It's just that they're irrelevant to the lives and fortunes of Yahweh's people. Anyway, as we have seen, by the time the Genesis account was written, there was a single male God responsible for all of creation and for all of history as well. And he does this without any help from a female or anyone, and he creates the entire cosmos simply by speaking it. In the Old Testament, he is still anthropomorphic in a lot of ways. He's stern, he's ruthless, he's capable of changing his mind. We remember some moments that we've had in myths that we've looked at earlier. He walks in the Garden of Eden in the evening where he talks to Adam and Eve. He plants the garden himself and then puts the people in it. He makes their clothes for them when he kicks them out of Eden. He shuts up the ark for Noah himself. He tests Job in ways that strike most of us as unfair or arbitrary or brutal. He makes Abraham believe that he has to sacrifice his only son Isaac. And in one of the most famous stories in the Old Testament, Abraham actually talks God out of destroying Sodom and Gomorrah, a classic argument. But in the first Genesis account, the very first one that we looked at, he's universal and benevolent. He made the entire world which is why later Christians and Muslims could accept this account of creation and adapt it for their own uses. Our point here is that he's masculine. Creation allows here for no female participation. Later, Christianity will restore the balance a little bit by elevating the Virgin Mary into the vessel in which God places his incarnate Son. And then later on, she becomes something not quite, but something like God's consort after her assumption into heaven. But for now, the first Genesis account illustrates the ways in which male creator gods have taken over creation roles from the goddess. The male creator could also be thought of as a craftsman. And this was easy to do because there were a lot of new crafts in these new cities. There were goldsmiths, and there were tool makers, and there were weapon makers, and there were weavers and carpenters and architects and potters. And it was easy enough to use their kind of craft work as a kind of homology for the way God would have created the world. God in this version is a kind of artisan. He takes the raw materials of nature and then shapes them to his own imagination. Nature was once the basis of the goddess power. In this vision, the vision of God as a maker, nature is only valuable insofar as it's transformed by the hands of the maker. The category of creation stories that this comes from is sometimes called Deus Faber, which just simply means God the maker. We didn't consider that as a separate category of creation stories back in Unit 1, but it occurs often enough that it could have been considered a category of its own. And we've already had some experience with this kind of category. Panku in art is almost always pictured holding a chisel or an adze or a hammer, suggesting that while he was pushing apart the heaven and the earth, he was also in a craftsman-like way was shaping the mountains and forging the earth. Marduk from the Enuma Elish is quite frequently pictured as a mason, as a dam builder, as a carpenter. Ptah in Egypt is quite often pictured with a potter's wheel, in which he makes the parts of the universe that he doesn't simply speak into being. In Africa, there are many gods creator gods who make humans out of clay with their hands. We've noticed that Nuku'a does that in China, and the Sumerian gods do that in the Sumerian and Babylonian stories. Yahweh in the second Genesis story seems to do the same thing, like a craftsman making a model of Adam out of clay and then breathing into his nostrils the breath of life. And God in many other myths can be pictured as a carpenter, as a smith, or as a weaver. In these myths, God has replaced the goddess. The maker takes over the function of the one who gives birth. Marie-Louise von France, in her Patterns of Creativity Mirrored in Creation Myths, says that in this kind of story, the deity is no longer immanent in the world. Rather, the deity shapes dead material into form, and that makes for a huge separation between subject and object, and the gap kills part of creation by seeing it as something dead, something inert, something to be manipulated rather than something sacred in itself, because it issues from the body of the goddess as a child does from its mother. Now, this isn't all bad. It doesn't have to be all bad. Mircea Eliade tells us over and over again that ancient peoples believed that all crafts, all skills, were gifts from the gods. Smiths and potters, they believed, didn't really think they had invented their crafts, but that they had been taught them by divine or semi-divine culture heroes who worked in the same way with them that God worked in creating the world in the first place. In this kind of view, every craft is therefore an axis mundi, which returns us back to sacred time and puts us in touch with sacred power. Every bowl, every rug, every weapon is a religious object. But our point here, and that very well may be true, but our point here is that these have all become here male activities. Each myth presents as a creator god's achievement what had at one time, we think, been the gift of a goddess. Once the transcendent sky gods took over, humans, of course, tended to lose touch with them. We said it was looked at all those African myths where God goes far enough away where he could be admired but not reached. Communication with gods becomes more complicated here, and here's where the idea of a priesthood kind of comes into play, because what you have is you have to have a specially trained group of people who have learned how to communicate with God and how to, in some ways, manipulate God, how to at least ask him for favors. And so the priests would be the people who would be trained to learn the formula, to do them correctly, to get the rites all in order, and to do them at the right times and in the right way with prayer and ritual to intercede on behalf of the people with the gods. That's a huge shift in human consciousness all by itself, since there was a time when the earth was thought of as sacred in itself because it was part of the goddess herself. And so humans over time have tried to reduce that space, to bring God back somehow into our lives again. One of them is the effort to recover the idea that the earth itself, the cosmos or nature, is itself sacred, contains the goddess or God within it. Interestingly, the view that nature itself is sacred is sometimes called animism, and in monotheistic religions, it's a heresy. It's a leftover from pagan times, since in those monotheistic religions, God is always thought of as outside of nature, as beyond nature, as detached from it, and therefore it is a heresy to find God inside of nature in this kind of way. In that older view, the god or goddess could be everywhere. It could be a mysterious presence, be found in nature, in every rock, in every tree, in every waterfall, and it could be found in other people. Sometimes the idea that nature itself is sacred is built into creation myths. We've had some of these already. When Pan-Ku or Ymir or Tiamat are taken apart to become the cosmos itself is divine by definition because it is made out of the body of a god or goddess. In an Okanagan story, these are Native Americans who once lived in Idaho and Western Oregon and Eastern Washington. The old one made the cosmos out of the body of a woman. Her flesh became soil, her bones became rocks, her breath became the wind, her hair became grass and trees. This, as we remember, is a dismembered God creation story. Some of her flesh was rolled into balls to make the ancient ones, and animals and humans. Thus all things, we are told, thus all living things came from the earth. When we look around, we can see our mother everywhere. That is, the cosmos is sacred because it's made out of the body of a god. In a myth from Tahiti, the creator god, Ta'aroa, is lonely when he emerges from his shell. So he uses part of the shell to make the sky, and then he makes the mountains out of his own spine, mountain slopes out of his ribs, fatness of the earth from his flesh, strength of earth from his arms and legs, scales and shells for fish out of his fingernails, trees, shrubs, and grasses out of his feathers, lobsters and shrimp and eels out of his intestines, rainbows and the redness of the sky out of his blood. And so again, when people of this myth look around, they see God everywhere too. God is in nature. God is everywhere around us. So these are some of the various ways by various people that an effort has been made somehow mythologically to close this gap between a transcendent God and the human world, to restore at least some of our earlier sense of oneness with the divine. This one is a particularly interesting one. Indian theologians, and we'll get more of this in our next lecture, think that that all of God and all of the universe are actually within us. Brahman, which is the totality of everything, Brahman in Hindu thoughts is God, but it's also Atman, the self. It's the first cause. It's the life force, which is everywhere and nowhere. Everything, you, I, the universe, gods and goddesses, including Vishnu and Shiva, are all Brahman. Everything is equally Brahman. Brahman, in this view, is neither male nor female, but it can manifest itself in many ways as the gods and goddesses we worship, as the universe we live in, as the other people we come in contact with every day. Brahman always lives beyond our comprehension, and he is too abstract to be pictured in any specific way. He is neither an older, white-bearded man on a celestial throne, nor is he a warrior ready to take on the next demon. These are all ideas of God, and they are all masks that God wears. But the idea of God, the basic, largest idea of God perhaps that humans have ever achieved, is this idea of Brahman. He, she, it has been given, has been given all kinds of definitions down through history by various cultures. But this may be, because it's the most abstract, maybe the most accurate picture of God which is possible for human beings. Taoism takes somewhat the similar track by suggesting that God can finally be best found inside ourselves. And mystics in all religions have worked in the same way, working from the inside out rather than the outside in. Leeming and Page cite a Zen master who once said, "The goal of the true Buddhist is to be rid of the Buddha." That is, to be able to move from an externalized view to a great mystery within ourselves. Prayer then becomes meditation rather than asking a powerful overlord for favors. Over the years, a lot of disciplines have been created to help us make that inward journey, which is still like the shaman's journey in earlier days. The shaman, remember, could travel from heaven to earth to the underworld while his body remained where it was. And so a lot of these techniques look like the techniques of the shaman, and they include things like deep meditation and yoga and dervish dancing and drugs and fasting and ritual chants, all of which are designed to break down the barrier between the mundane and the eternal, to help us to a moment of access mundi, to help us descend deep within ourselves, which is where we will find God in this theory. Christians have had their mystics too, like Saint Teresa of Avila, who's memorialized in Bernini's sculpture of her in Rome. And Muslims have had their mystics too. One of the most famous is the 13th century Persian poet Jalal al-Din Rumi, who founded the whirling dervishes in the mystical Sufi branch of Islam. What they would do is they would whirl and whirl and whirl until they broke through ordinary gravity and dizziness to achieve the ecstasy of the presence of God within themselves. And in our own age, psychologists and psychological readers of myths, especially Jungians, have secularized this quest by locating the great mythic archetypes not out there, but in here, in our own minds and psyches, waiting for the discovery to be discovered and then explored. One of the really charming and beautiful pictures of the God within comes from the Yoruba people of West Africa. They have a pantheon made up of what are called orishas. Orishas are fragments of the original God who broke into hundreds or maybe even thousands of fragments one time earlier. Those orishas can be external gods, and they can be located through all of nature. They can be everywhere. But equally, orishas live inside us. Every single moment that we experience, every single thought we have is perhaps an orisha. The Yoruba have a divination ritual, which is whereby casting nuts on a plate, you can tell what the gods have in mind for us, what the future holds. This is the orishas talking to us. But interestingly, in that divination process, the orishas don't tell you directly what to do. What the divination ritual consists of is that a diviner, somebody who's really experienced, who knows how to do this, will then recite, based on the way the nuts fall on the plate, will give you dozens of proverbs and stories and sayings, and just keep going until some one of them resonates inside yourself. You have to recognize when the God talks to you. How can you recognize when the God talks to you? Because the God is inside us. The orishas live in us as well as out there. And so the moment of discovery is the moment when I suddenly say, stop. That's the one. That's the one that makes sense to me. Now I know where I'm going. These are some of the ways in which humans over the centuries have tried to diminish the gap between a transcendent God and ourselves. That gap that was significantly widened by the triumph of the male creator God or gods over the goddess. There are others, of course. In Christianity, God sends his son to become a human, to mediate between the two worlds. Krishna in Hinduism is incarnated many times to make a connection between the two worlds. And Islam has prophets, of whom Muhammad is the last, who bring the word of a transcendent and remote God to his people. All of these are responses to the distance opened up between the mundane and the divine by the replacement of the goddess by male sky gods. Well, this lecture finishes our brief biography of God. In our next lecture, we'll try to review much of the territory that we've been over in the last 8 lectures. As we started with a couple of pantheons, we'll end with a pantheon, and we'll take a look at one mythology, that of Indian Hinduism, and we'll trace it from the development of God from the days before the pre-Aryan invasions until at the very end, when we reach this last stage, Brahman becomes a theological abstraction. That's next time.